Today's video is brought to you by our sponsor, Speak. As a linguist and speaker of Korean, I'm always asked the same question. Why don't you learn Japanese? It should be easy for you, right? And honestly, I understand why people would think that. Korean and Japanese are remarkably similar. Both put the verb at the end of the sentence, both use particles to mark things like subjects and objects, and both have elaborate systems for politeness. If I had to list all the similarities, we'd be here all day. Which always makes me wonder, why? Are Korean and Japanese actually related? For example, we know why Spanish, French, and Italian are similar. They all descended from Latin. So did something similar happen with Japanese and Korean? You might think the answer is obvious, but linguists have been arguing about this for nearly a century. So today we're going to answer a deceptively simple question. Are Korean and Japanese similar because they share a common language ancestor? Or is there something else at play? But to answer that, we first have to answer a more basic question. What would actually prove that two languages are related? Languages can become similar for many reasons. They can inherit words and grammatical features from a common ancestor. They can influence each other through prolonged contact, or they can independently develop similar features by coincidence. So resemblance alone doesn't tell us which explanation is correct. Take English and German. English father, German Vater. English foot, German Fuß. English mouse, German Maus. What's convincing isn't simply that these words look similar. It's that across hundreds of words, we find regular sound correspondences. English F corresponds to German V, English T corresponds to German S. These patterns recur again and again. So that's what historical linguists are looking for. If the same kind of differences consistently appear across a large vocabulary, we can reconstruct how those words may have developed from an ancestral language. Remember the question I mentioned at the beginning of the video? As a Korean speaker, why don't I learn Japanese? Well, today we're going to put that challenge to the test. I've always been curious what it would be like to speak Japanese. So when Speak challenged me to practice Japanese for 10 minutes a day for 7 days, I was actually really excited. Mizu kudasai. Right off the bat, what I really like about Speak is that it isn't just giving me vocabulary lists to memorize. It has that cute little character that speaks to me, guiding me through useful conversations every single day.
予約は4人です。
予約は4人です. And like the app's name suggests, most of the time you're just speaking to the app.
ベジタリアンのメニューありますか?
ベジタリアンのメニューありますか? You're not spending time, reading or typing loads. You're speaking the language, just with training wheels. And with free talk, I can choose a topic and have a more open-ended conversation.
いらっしゃいませ。何名様ですか?
一人です。
お一人ですね。こちらカウンター席へどうぞ。
お水ください. If you want to try it for yourself, you can start your free week with Speak using the link below. Okay, back to whether Japanese and Korean are actually related. So what happens when we apply that test to Korean and Japanese? Linguists have proposed hundreds of possible cognates, words that appear to have been inherited from the same ancestral form. One major attempt came from historical linguist John Whitman. In his 1985 dissertation, Whitman proposed 347 Korean-Japanese cognates and argued that they formed a system of sound correspondences. Several decades later, Alexander Vovin, a specialist in Japanese historical linguistics, went through Whitman's proposals and found serious problems with many of the comparisons. Vovin rejected 261 of Whitman's 347 proposals, citing problems such as irregular sound correspondences, problems with the historical evidence, and semantic mismatches between the proposed cognates. He argued that another 75 were better explained as Korean loans into Japanese. That left just 11 possible cognates, of which he only considered 6 to be particularly strong. One disputed example is the word for three. Whitman compared Middle Korean's sei with Old Japanese saki in sakikusa, a plant name interpreted as meaning three-branch grass. Woven, however, rejected it as an inherited cognate. He points out that sake only appears in the Old Japanese material from Western and Central Japan, and only in this particular compound rather than functioning as an independent Japanese word for three. On that basis, he argues that it can only be a loan from Korean. The 6 comparisons that he considered much stronger include the words for fire, fill with water, hold, take, crane, field, and melon. And some of these really do look striking. Take the word for fire. Middle Korean has pul, while Old Japanese has pui. The forms aren't identical, but they're close enough to suggest that something systematic may be going on. Both begin with P, and the vowels could be potentially related to a regular sound correspondence. Crane is another interesting case. Middle Korean has turumi, while Old Japanese has turu. Again, the words aren't identical, but there are enough similarities in their overall shape that Woven considered the comparison a possible cognate. But Woven wasn't just looking at vocabulary. He also examined proposed grammatical correspondences, including case markers, pronouns, adjective endings, verb markers, etc. One example is a grammatical marker used to identify a direct object, roughly what modern Korean ul and lir does. Middle Korean had several forms, including ones resembling the modern-day forms, while Old Japanese used wo, which eventually became modern Japanese o. And based on all of his analysis, he argued that given the very small number of likely cognates, even if Korean and Japanese descended from a common language, it would have been a very, very long time ago. But the debate didn't end there. In 2016, another linguist, Alexander Francis-Ratte, revisited the question with a much larger set of proposed cognates. In his 2016 dissertation, he proposed more than 500 possible cognates. Since his dissertation, there has again been back and forth among linguists trying to argue one way or the other. But there was actually a fundamental problem with this endeavor all along. We don't have equally good evidence for what Japanese and Korean sounded like at the relevant points in history. For Japanese, we have substantial written evidence from the 8th century, including the Manyoshu, an anthology of more than 4,500 Japanese poems compiled during the Nara period around 759 AD. The poems are written using Chinese characters, but most of them were used phonetically to represent Japanese sounds, a system known as Manyogana. These spellings give linguists valuable evidence on how Old Japanese was pronounced. And during that time, Korean had a similar situation, but the evidence is harder to interpret. Korean was also being written with Chinese characters through systems like Idu, Hyangchal, and Kugyeol, which could represent Korean sounds. But the surviving material is more limited, and these 3 systems were used in many different ways, making it harder to determine exactly which sounds the characters represented. Fortunately, the situation becomes much better in the 15th century when Hangul was created under King Sejong. Hangul was explicitly designed to represent Korean sounds, and these Joseon-era texts give us a lot of good evidence for what Middle Korean sounded like. So that's why Middle Korean is often the form of Korean used most often when comparing it with Japanese. That creates a problem. When we compare Old Japanese with Middle Korean, we're not comparing 2 languages recorded at the same moment. Our clearest evidence for Korean comes about 700 years later, so linguists often have to work backward to reconstruct what Korean sounded like centuries before. And there's only so much certainty we can have when doing that. And on top of that, our understanding of these historical sound systems has changed over time. By the 20th century, scholars had established that Old Japanese had a more complicated vowel system than modern Japanese. Many early texts preserve distinctions reconstructed as 8 vowels rather than the 5 vowel system of modern Japanese. But even that 8 vowel analysis remains debated. Some argue that the evidence can be explained with fewer underlying vowels treating some distinctions as sequences involving glides or diphthongs. And that actually matters a lot for establishing sound correspondences. Before we can argue that a Korean sound corresponds to a Japanese one, we need to know what that sound actually was. And there's another explanation we have to take seriously. Contact. Japan is an island nation and the Korean Peninsula lies just across the sea. For centuries, Korea was one of the main routes through which people, technology, writing, and culture reached the Japanese archipelago. That contact became particularly intense from the late 4th through the 7th centuries. During this period, people from the Korean Peninsula were actively migrating and settling in Japan, while the Yamato court maintained close political and cultural ties with the Korean kingdoms. One of those kingdoms was Baekje in southwestern Korea. In the 5th century, Baekje sent scholars to Japan who introduced Chinese characters and the Chinese writing system. And this was a major development for Japan because prior to this, it had no native writing system of its own. So from this point forward, Chinese characters became the basis for writing Japanese. Given the scale of this contact, it's not surprising that Vovin argues that many of the proposed Korean-Japanese cognates were better understood as Korean loans to Japanese, dating largely to this period. The idea of a common ancestor does not stop with Korean and Japanese. Historically, some linguists have proposed that the two languages belong to a much larger family, the Altaic language family. According to this theory, Korean and Japanese would be related to languages like Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic. The languages do share some striking similarities. For example, they all generally place the verb at the end of the sentence. They also share various grammatical features and have sets of vocabulary that earlier scholars proposed as cognates. But the broader Altaic relationship is highly controversial. Similar grammatical structures can arise through contact, and many proposed cognates don't show the regular sound correspondences we'd expect from an established language family. So the same question comes up again. Are these similarities inherited, or are they the result of contact? So where does that leave us? Korean and Japanese really are remarkably similar languages. The question is why? If we go back to Vovin's analysis, he was left with only 6 possible cognates with particularly strong phonological correspondences. And there's another striking absence. None of those 6 possible cognates are basic body part words. In well-established language families, words for things like head, hand, eye, and foot are often among the clearest evidence of common inheritance. At the same time, the evidence for historical contact is much stronger. For Vovin, this makes an areal relationship, languages becoming similar through prolonged contact, a more plausible explanation than a shared genetic ancestor. And after doing the research for this video, I'm inclined to agree with him. None of this proves that Korean and Japanese are unrelated. A very remote genetic relationship remains possible. But given the small number of convincing cognates and the history between the two countries, I think these similarities are better explained by centuries of contact than by a shared common ancestor. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time.